Another video about panoramic photography is here. We said that if possible, we would try to take multiple compositions from one spot, but with different focal lengths. For example, with a longer lens. Do you see any opportunity for another composition here? Can we find something for a longer lens that includes all three compositional planes?
To be honest, I don't see much. This composition seems to be ideal for wide or even ultra-wide focal lengths. Finding three planes for longer lenses here would be very difficult. After all, shooting in the Lofoten Islands is mainly about composition with wide lenses.
But back to practical photography. So we have set up the tripod level, chosen the composition and the lens. What's next? Setting exposure parameters and focusing. Let's start with exposure. In the video The Magic of Exposure Bracketing, we explained in detail why and in what cases we use exposure bracketing. But to keep things simple at the beginning, we'll choose a panorama composition where we don't need exposure bracketing. We'll cover multi-row panoramic photography combined with exposure bracketing and anti-reflective shots in the following videos. In which case do we not need to use exposure bracketing? Just to remind you, it's for compositions where we only shoot the landscape without sky. Then the dynamic range of the scene is relatively small and we can manage with just one exposure. If we are shooting a landscape composition with the sky, we almost always need to turn on exposure bracketing. An exception might be really cloudy weather, when the sky is grey, the light is soft and the scene's dynamics are low. Even in this case, we recommend using exposure bracketing. But we can say, with a wink, that we can do without it. Alright, we know that for our composition, we don't need exposure bracketing. Anyway, in this case, we'll still choose the manual mode. Why? If we were shooting in aperture priority mode, the camera would adjust the exposure time differently for each individual shot, and the photos wouldn't match tonally within the panorama. So we definitely need the manual mode. Next, we'll set the camera's basic ISO, usually ISO 100. But what exposure time should we set? We'll be shooting, let's say, 200 degrees panorama. Different lights fall on each part of the scene. So what will be the ideal time for the entire panorama? Photography literature suggests one approach. Aim the camera at the brightest part of the future panorama, set the time to the center of the exposure meter, and remember the time. Then, aim the camera at the darkest part of the future panorama, and repeat the whole process. This way, we'll get two extreme time values. The average of these two is then our final time, compromised for the entire panorama. However, we set the exposure slightly brighter than the result, by 1/3 to 1 EV up. Why? When darkening a brighter photo, noise does not occur. When bringing out details from the shadows, noise occurs. In misty compositions, unclear structures in forests, etc., we add light even more significantly, often even more than 1 EV. The histogram must be shifted all the way to the right, but without overexposure. Extracting details from shadows not only introduces noise, but also degradation of the details and a general decline in the technical quality of the photo. During the technical advancement of cameras, this phenomenon started to fade into the background. However, with the current trend of maximizing camera resolution, this phenomenon is once again very relevant. For prints of small size, technical precision is not so necessary. On the other hand, prints of a meter wide and larger will not forgive any imperfections. Let's go back to setting the exposure correctly. The method we talk about really works, but personally I didn't like it. I dislike doing calculations and generally it feels like a tedious task to me. So I try to simplify the whole process, and after many tests I came up with this approach. We aim the camera at the brightest spot within the entire panorama. The initial time setting can be done according to the exposure scale that is set to the middle. We take the shot and check if the brightest spot is overexposed or not. That's why it's ideal to have the highlight indication turned on in the camera. If the brightest spot is not overexposed, we increase the exposure by 0.3 EV, that is towards the brighter side. Again, we take the shot and check the brightest spot. And if it's not overexposed, we repeat the process. And we repeat the process until the overexposure appears on the brightest spot. As soon as it becomes visible, we decrease the exposure by 0.3 EV back to the negative side. That is, to the time when there was no overexposure at the brightest spot. This way, we know that we have exposed the brightest spot as bright as possible, but without overexposure. So we don't need to calculate anything. The whole process can be even faster. Sony camera owners can turn on a feature called Zebra in live view, which directly shows overexposure on the screen. They don't need to take any test shots. They simply adjust the exposure until the overexposure disappears from the brightest part of the photo on the screen. Done, and they can start taking photos. Quick, right? If someone has a different brand of camera, they can use the histogram display in live view and adjust the exposure until the histogram indicates no overexposure. I have to admit personally, I never completely relied on the histogram in live view 100% and always preferred to take a test shot. And what's the next step? We have dealt with the brightest spot in the future panorama, and we know, thanks to the method we have used, it will not be overexposed. But what about the rest of the panorama? I mean in terms of exposure. Good news, we don't have to worry about the rest. If we are shooting a scene that's not too demanding in terms of dynamic range, then all we need to do is deal with the brightest spot to ensure it's not overexposed. We don't need to worry about the rest. Based on extensive testing, we can confidently say that the rest of the panorama will fit within the camera's dynamic range. How to properly adjust the exposure setting for the whole panorama, but without using exposure bracketing?
Okay, I'll show you. So, we'll find the brightest spot within the future panorama. It is over there in the sky. We are in manual mode. First, let's go through the process for cameras without Zebra. It means mainly Nikon and Canon. We turn on the histogram in the live view, like this. We adjust the exposure time to prevent overexposure while at the same time ensuring that the histogram data is accumulated as much to the right as possible. Let me shorten the time. It's still overexposed. Like this. Now we can see data is accumulated at the right side of the histogram, but it is not touching the histogram box. Maybe one step more. And now it should be okay. So we take a test photo. We display it on the screen and turn on the overexposure warning. And we check if there's any overexposure in the brightest area. I can see all 4 histograms are okay. Nothing is blinking here, so this picture is not overexposed and it's exposed correctly. If there is no overexposure, everything is fine and we can proceed with the exposure. If there is an overexposure, we need to shorten the exposure time even more, ideally by 0.3 EV. And then we expose again and repeat the whole process until all overexposure disappears. The goal is to have the brightest spot in the future panorama exposed as brightly as possible, but without overexposure, like the sky here.
And what about photographers with Sony brand cameras? They have access to Zebra indicating overexposure directly on live view. Does it speed up the workflow?
Definitely. For Sony cameras, we have access to Zebra function. Let me turn on the Zebra, and now let me shorten the time until all Zebra disappears. Now this picture is without overexposure.
Alright, but how do I make sure that the photo will not be too dark?
Okay, let me clarify. I need to set the exposure time so the picture is as bright as possible but without overexposure. Is that clear?
And that's all for today, friends. And what's coming up next? Another video about panoramic photography. We are still not done with the know-how we want to share with you. What do you think about today's video? Did you learn anything interesting? If yes, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And as always, if you have experience with panoramic photography, encountered any problems, troubles or anything else, please write to us in the comments below the video. See you!
By the way, have you heard that you can join us on our exclusive photography expeditions to Lofoten and Iceland? If you want to know more, check the link below.